All right, welcome everybody to the second session of the day here. My name is David Horst Lehman. I'm at Westminster College. We're here welcoming Cole Mellinger, Sarah Donovan, and Laura Macaluso. And we're looking forward to hearing from all three of them. And then I'll say a few words after they're done and maybe start off with some questions. But you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to them and ask your questions to them, right? So we'll for sure make sure there's time for that question and answer at the end. First of all, can we just have like a round of applause thanking them in advance? Woo. Thank you for being willing to share your work, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. We'll just go in the order that they appear in the program, and then we'll have the question and answer, all right? So you're up, Cole.
All right. Hopefully this works.
Yep. There you go.
All right. So thank you everyone for attending the Pennsylvania Historical Association Conference this year in 2024. And so I'm going to delve into a topic that a lot of people usually don't really recognize when they talk about the history of Pennsylvania, which are the Swedes in the Delaware Valley before the arrival of William Penn. And so my argument pertains to the topic of the Swedish incorporation of English imperialism and the decline of Lenape power in the years immediately preceding William Penn's arrival. And so I give a brief timeline here of the settlements in the 17th century Delaware Valley. As you can tell here, this is a map of the Delaware Valley, at least the upper portions. And so then 1631, the Dutch actually created a colony in southern Delaware, present-day Lewes, Delaware, called the Zwavendale Colony. And in this colony, because of the various tensions with the Lenape actually... hate to say it, but they actually murdered all of the Dutch settlers, and so within less than a year, all of the Dutch settlers ended up gone. And so now this area is vacant, quote unquote, except for the Lenape. And so then 1638, the New Sweden colony then is formed, until in 1655, the Dutch actually conquer the Delaware Valley, with the Swedes, many of them actually remaining in the Delaware Valley after the Dutch conquer it. And so the Dutch are not only colonizing with Dutch people, but yet also are ruling over Swedish people. And then by 1665, that's a typo there, 1665, the English actually rule over the Delaware Valley from Albany, New York, and Newcastle. And with the exception of 1674, they rule in this area until the English under William Penn arrive and create the proprietary colony of Pennsylvania. And so most scholars tend to focus on the New Sweden colony and the proprietary colony of William Penn in their work. And so looking at the various secondary source materials, I found various journal articles and monographs dealing with the 17th century Delaware Valley, but two monographs really stand out. Mark L. Thompson, 2013, wrote The Contest for the Delaware Valley. And in this monograph, he argued that there were various sovereignties, colonial and European. So you had Maryland, you had West Jersey, you had Albany, New York, the Dutch, the Swedes, all trying to control this area in the Delaware Valley, all interlapping with each other. In essence, you have this constant competition for this land, either for land deeds, either for the ports that are established in the Delaware Valley. And so it's this constant area of contention. And so Lenape Country, written by Jean Soderlund, she actually details about the society of the Delaware Valley and argues through an indigenous perspective for one of the first times that the Lenape actually maintain power in this region, as well as their sovereignty, even up until the arrival of William Penn. So they're controlling the land deals, they're controlling things behind the scenes, essentially, is what she argues. And so I looked at the various source materials that they utilized, mostly from the New York State Archives. the British Delaware Papers, or the British Delaware Administrative Records. I looked at the Edmund Andros Papers. Edmund Andros, by the way, was the governor from Albany, New York, that ruled in the Delaware Valley immediately preceding the arrival of William Penn. And then I looked at a set of underutilized records, the Upland Court records. And so imagine right here around Chester County, you have Delaware County, Philadelphia. Remember how I mentioned that the Dutch ruled over the Swedes? Well, most of the Swedes are around in this area. And they actually have an independent governing body there under Dutch authority. And so it's almost like a federalized system. And so in this case, you have the Swedes who can actually dictate their own religion, language, and culture in this area, which is very unique considering the 17th century as a whole in North America. And so here's actually a sample of what the Upland Court sessions actually look like in the New York State Archives. And so, again, they're a little bit tattered, of course, but what's very interesting, though, is that they're in English. Why is that? Because under Edmund Andros, they were actually under the jurisdiction of the English, and so they actually had these records then transported to Albany, New York, to then be stored in the government archives. And so you notice that there's brackets where the justices are up top, and then you have the court proceedings down below. They are both judicial and legislative in nature. And so essentially it is governing this area for the most part. And so I found various different themes, though, in looking at these records. One was that, of course, this was a very diverse area. When I mention the term Swede, I not only mean the Swedish people, I mean the Swedish, the Finnish, the German, the Dutch, and even some English in this area. It's very confusing, but yet it was a very diverse society where they actually included different ethnicities in this area. And so, also I noticed that there was a class structure, a semi-rigid class structure where you had the upper Swedes and you had the lower Swedes. They all had their own different goals, of course, being the class structure that it was, but yet they had some commonalities with each other. And I also asked the question, to what extent are they cooperating with English authority? And how does that relate to the Lenape? And so I determined that the well-off and less prominent Swedes of the upland jurisdiction generally cooperated with and adapted to the English imperialist system under Andros during the 1670s through the enforcement of English regulations, the participation in the English imperialist economies, and acquiring land in various English jurisdictions. The various Swedes also cooperated with their indigenous neighbors, but due to the Swedes' alliance with the English, led to their decline of power in the region. And so, I give a little bit of background here. I'm just going to mention briefly that this area that we're talking about for the Lenape is known as Lenape-Hoking. Lenape-Hoking is a term used by the Lenape to refer to their homeland, which is around the Delaware Valley, and it's their most sacred land. And so keep that in mind when we go through this. And so in determining what the New Sweden colony was, their main goal was to trade with furs and to develop small tobacco plantations. They had to cooperate with the Lenape and the Susquehannock. The Susquehannock are just located just west of the Delaware River. They actually monopolized the fur trade during this period of time. And so you can imagine that the Swedes have to depend upon the Lenape for crops and the Susquehannock for the furs. And so Governor Johann Prince, up here, desired, because of this dependence on the indigenous people, to wring the necks of all the natives. So there's no middlemen. And then, of course, the next governor, Rising, reluctantly cooperated with the Susquehannock. They literally led them the Susquehannock led Rising down a path of diplomacy. He actually held his hand and led him down a path of diplomacy. And so you can tell that the indigenous people are instrumental in the success of the initial New Sweden colony. So they had a special relationship with each other. And then under Dutch rule, they established the government after they conquered New Sweden. And then they left the Swedes to essentially govern themselves, besides paying a few quit rents. And then they established ports and small plantations in southern Delaware Valley, but nothing in comparison to the English rule. When the English, particularly under Governor Lovelace, desired to create decent-sized plantations in Delaware Valley, a gentleman named Marcus Jacobson, also known as the Lone Finn or the Lone Swede by many contemporaries of his day, desired to create an independent Swedish colony again, because the English to him were considered authoritarian. They could develop the land and they could potentially take away their culture. And so with the help of the Lenape and with the Swedish government's help and with the help of other allies in the region, he hoped to develop a independent new Sweden colony again. Unfortunately for the Lone Finn, prominent Swedes such as Peter Kock, who were members of the Upland Court, helped in the aid to capture Marcus Jacobson. And then he was sent off to Barbados as an indentured servant. And then, and then his subordinates were severely fined. Now, I mention this because people such as Peter Kock and his family are the ones who are going to be ruling the Delaware Valley from then on. And so you can imagine that people such as Peter Kock are going to have the English interests in hand and not the Lenape interests. And so it made it easier then for Edmund Andros to then develop a stricter jurisdiction in the Delaware Valley. And so it became more rigid in structure, because before then there was a sense of a government in Newcastle, but they weren't sure exactly where power lied. But now it's becoming more concrete. All thanks to the Swedes who cooperate with Edmund Andros. And Edmund Andros also had to make peace with the Lenape because, again, when you have peace, you can develop economically. And so when he made the peace, he almost immediately afterwards then established 3 court jurisdictions, including the Upland Court. He included the Upland Court in one of his jurisdictions. Now, they did maintain autonomy, but now they are under the constant supervision of High Sheriff Edmund Cantwell. They are now constantly being supervised in almost every single Upland Court session by this individual. And so now they can't operate as independently as they used to. Now, he also had a land program that he tried to initiate, and he did so successfully. When they gained a certain amount of land, they had to improve the land or to develop it for agricultural purposes. That way then they could adequately pay their quit rents, which were in the form of foodstuffs that would then be sent off to New York, New England, and Barbados. By the way, at this point in time in the 17th century, Barbados is becoming more and more and more of a sugar plantation colony, and so they need the grains to feed their enslaved people. And so these people are now involved in that economic structure. So the Upland Court cooperates by granting land purchased from the Lenape. So they purchase the land from the Lenape, and then they grant land to individuals by the authority of Andros, and mentioning, in quote, that you should improve the land according to the governor's regulations. And so they are establishing this fact every single time that they need to improve this land. The quit rents are divided up into each of the 4 Upland Court sessions. They meet every quarter of the year, and so this way then it's more efficient for people to then pay their quit rents. They also installed fences for one of the first times, though they actually did have openings for the Lenape, so that they did not essentially piss off their Lenape neighbors. And then the punishment was either that the land would be taken away or fines imposed. And so an example of this is roughly 5 guilders were paid every quarter year. Guilders, by the way, are Dutch currency. But in this time period, when I say guilders, think about converting that into foodstuffs. Think about converting that into grain products and pork products. And so imagine if they don't pay their quarterly quit rent, that they have to pay 5 times as much in a fine. Actually, 4 people were fined because of this. And then by 1677, those who did not pay for patents of land were fined an additional equivalent of 200 guilders. Think about 26 guilders a year for your quit rents, and you have to pay an additional 200 guilders for your fine. That's impressive. And so there were 2 instances where land was confiscated. Goodlaw Andries, he did not actually pay for the land, and so instead of fining him 200 guilders, they just authorized Cantwell, the high sheriff, to take the land away from him. Jacobus Fabricus was a very interesting individual. He was a preacher, and what's interesting is that when he did not want to pay taxes on his land, it wasn't the church land, it was his own land, he would not obtain the land because he said, I'm not going to pay taxes on it because I'm above the he deemed himself above the law because he was essentially a clergyman. And so they said, nuh-uh, you have to abide by the English regulations. And so the acquisitions occurred like this. You had 100 or 300 acre plots of land. The less well-off Swedes, those of the lower class, usually obtained 100 acres of land away from the Delaware River, so it was on one of the tributaries, mostly the Schuylkill River. And then the well-off or the better Swedes, they ended up getting 300 acres of land along the Delaware River. And so you can imagine that would be beneficial for the prominent Swedes because the Delaware River is a highway. This is where they can communicate with other people. This is where, This is where they can communicate with Lenape if they're trading with them. This is where they can meet relatives, maybe who are over in West Jersey, which I deal with in my main thesis, actually, in my master's thesis. And so here are some of the names of the prominent Swedes. So I boldened the ones that were actually members of the Upland Court at one time. Again, they're taking advantage of the situation. They're going to gain the land along the Delaware River, not these less prominent Swedes. And by the way, just to let you know that these less prominent Swedes, they are very diverse. They are Dutch, Swedish, and possibly German as well. And so John Bolson is an example I give. He obtained 100 acres of property along the Schuylkill River, just above the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He had to pay, of course, in foodstuffs, and so his foodstuffs went maybe even to Barbados. We do not know exactly where they went. But we do have a physical testimony of participating in this English system. His house, his cottage. It was built between 1678 to 1684. It's now in the Fairmount Park Conservatory. What's interesting is that it looks very much Dutch. And it's very interesting, though, on how they're incorporating different cultures also in this period. And so what was the indigenous response, right? So I mentioned about all of this cooperation. So now, because the English are established all throughout the Delaware Valley, they have nobody else to turn to, essentially. And so they actually become less violent. They actually threaten people, and they don't really kill people too much anymore because they realize they also got smallpox, by the way. And so their population is dwindling at this point in time. And so can you imagine you have more colonists and you have less people? You're not going to want to provoke violence. There was one instance that I want to point out in 1680, the Crewcorn settlement. They were essentially Quakers sent by Edmund Andros to the upper portion of the Upland Court jurisdiction. And by the way, I just realized about 2 weeks ago that the Upland Court actually incorporated the Crewcorn settlement by adding one justice to the Upland Court. And so now you have this brand new English settlement now integrated into the Upland Court. Now what's interesting is that the Lenape were not too happy with this. They actually ended up threatening them. But what's interesting to me is that the Swedes, who are in constant contact and have a special relationship with the Swedes or with the Lenape, that they would allow for this settlement to occur. And so it's a very interesting dynamic where these people, remember from the Lom Fin Rebellion, that they supported the English. Again, they are supporting the English. And so it's very interesting to see this change in allegiance over time from being reliant upon the Lenape to now kind of gearing themselves towards a new society. And so by the time of William Penn's arrival in 1682, the Swedes cooperated and adapted to Andros's English imperial system. William Penn, therefore, had few issues in establishing peace with many of the Swedes and creating a permanent English settlement that became a vital area of commerce in the English Atlantic. However, the influx of more settlers meant new problems for the Lenape and the various indigenous people who called Pennsylvania their home. And so, again, with the Swedes, imagine if they would defend their Lenape brethren the way that they depended upon the Lenape, and if they would have stopped that crude corn settlement and they would have taken more caution with William Penn, maybe things may have been slightly different. I thank you all very much for my presentation.
Oh, there we go. All right,
Sorry.
thanks.
That's fine.
Next we have Sarah Donovan.
Should grab that too.
Sure.
All right, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to my fellow panelists and to David for providing commentary. And I'm really just happy to be here. So, in May 1768, Joseph Rigby, an agent for the Leighton Port American Trading Company, reported to his employers that moving goods west to be traded with Native Americans at Pittsburgh and Detroit was growing near impossible. He complained that backcountry residents were, quote, continually prying into every wagon and package that comes to the gate to know the contents, and often ask whether there is any powder or lead going back to kill the Scotch-Irishmen. This instance in 1768 was part of a decades-long struggle over indigenous politics and diplomacy that brought the question of trade to the forefront. As Native alliances shifted over the course of the 7 Years' War and later the Pan-Indian Pontiac's War, the question of Native American trade became hotly contested. British colonial and imperial leaders, as well as colonists living along the backcountry, feared that Native Americans would exploit their alliances and trade relationships with the British and make war with the weapons they acquired through that trade. However, these groups were only united by this common fear. As war raged during the 1750s and 60s, colonial and imperial leaders struggled to agree on who had the authority to broker peace with Native Americans and regulate a trade. In the midst of these overlapping claims to authority, colonial and imperial leaders agreed to varying degrees that ultimately trade with Native Americans was a powerful diplomatic tool to broker peace and put an end to violence. However, to those living along the frontier, the establishment of a trade with the very native groups that had caused so much fear and violence for decades felt like a bitter betrayal. Backcountry residents' particular fixation on the trade of powder, guns, and lead that Joseph Rigby noted in 1768 is representative of the deeply personal and immediate fears of Native American violence along the frontier. In a 1756 letter, Edward Shippen, a justice of the peace in Lancaster County, observed that Native Americans, quote, have destroyed and carried away captive near 1,000 of men, women, and children, and we are hearing almost every day of more or less of our back inhabitants being cut off. Shippen's observation on the state of the frontier fell within a long list of reports regarding the progress of the 7 Years' War throughout the entire colony of Pennsylvania. But for backcountry residents, the reality of war was immediate and ever-present. As the 7 Years' War bled into Pontiac's War, both literally and figuratively, frontier residents became frustrated with ambiguous Indian policies that seemed to ignore their lived experiences.
as the question of trade was negotiated and renegotiated between colonial and imperial elites and various indigenous groups throughout the 1750s and 60s, backcountry settlers found themselves stuck in the crossfire, enduring the violence elicited not only from the French and their indigenous allies, but also from disillusioned former indigenous allies of the British. By 1763, frontier folk decided to wade into these debates over Indian policy and authority themselves. The formation of violent extra-legal groups such as the Paxton Boys in 1763 and 64 and the Black Boys in 1765 provided backcountry residents with an outlet to express their grievances through what they considered just and legitimate violence. As the question of authority remained fluid and ambiguous during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War, trade became the keystone issue that frontier folk used to address this ambiguity and to claim their own authority over Indian affairs and over their communities through a specific language of violence. As alliances with native groups like the Delaware shifted throughout the 7 Years' War, British imperial leaders in both diplomatic and military roles responded by attempting to mollify indigenous groups through trade. In an attempt to broker peace with the Delaware, who had allied with the French against the British and the Iroquois in 1756, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, William Johnson, and his deputy, George Croghan, worked with colonial authorities within Pennsylvania to negotiate the Easton Treaty in 1758, in which the Delaware and the Shawnee agreed to end their alliance with the French. While reflecting on the benefits of this treaty, William Johnson, did I go backwards? There we go. William Johnson emphasized the importance of trade, writing, "I am convinced trade is one of the strongest cements to bind our Indian connections." George Croghan, who was present for all of the proceedings at Easton and had communication with native groups living in Pittsburgh and beyond, echoed Johnson's insistence that trade would reap peace. In explaining his expenses in the pursuit of Indian affairs in a 1759 letter to General John Stanwix, Croghan argued that as soon as this fort is built and a good trade established here, the expense of Indian affairs will be much lessened. Much like Johnson, Croghan believed that establishing a trade would forward both imperial and colonial goals for peace, writing, "Now is the time to regulate the trade with the provinces and to put things on good and lasting foundation with all the Indian nations for the good of His Majesty's future Indian interest." Johnson and Croghan, who viewed the establishment of a trade as an expression of imperial power, saw the trade as a diplomatic solution to the problem of confusing indigenous alliances. In viewing Native American violence and warfare from a broad imperial lens, these men focused on the long-term impact of Native alliances versus the immediate impact of the establishment of a trade. As Croghan wrote, their goals were to secure His Majesty's future Indian interest, which did not necessarily align with the interests of other colonial leaders or backcountry residents. The connection between a Native American trade and the advancement of the British Empire in North America was a theme repeated by imperial leaders throughout both the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War. William Johnson often repeated his sentiments on trade to other imperial leaders. In a 1761 letter to Jeffrey Amherst, the current commander-in-chief for North America, William Johnson emphasized that the benefits of Native American alliances and treaties could not be reaped without the establishment of an Indian trade, writing, "The benefit of a free, extensive, and well-regulated trade will, it is true, be one of the most effectual measures to convince them of a British alliance." Even leaders in London were resolute that trade was a critical issue. In his 1763 instructions to General Jeffrey Amherst regarding the transfer of power from Amherst to the new commander-in-chief Thomas Gage, the Earl of Egremont encouraged Amherst to take special care with the Native American trade, writing, "Attend to what is suggested of keeping a large military force in the forts already erected and proposed to be kept up for the security of the Indian trade." Egremont's inclusion of trade in these instructions makes clear that even statesmen in London believed that maintaining trade with Native Americans was a critical role that fell under the authority of imperial leaders. However, while imperial leaders remained confident that trade would create a positive relationship with Native American groups and the British Empire in North America, local and colonial leaders were far more hesitant. Despite Johnson's insistence that trade was not only beneficial but essential to effective Native American diplomacy, other colonial and imperial leaders seemed less sure. In a 1759 report to Pennsylvania proprietor Thomas Penn, Edward Shippen expressed his concerns about establishing a trade with Native Americans, writing that he feared the French are supplying them with ammunition and every instrument of cruelty which their malice can invent, which must in process of time ruin us. Shippen's concern about Native American duplicity reflects his different perspective on brokering peace with indigenous tribes. Unlike Johnson and Croghan, who aimed to forward imperial goals, colonial leaders like Shippen were far more concerned with the tangible results of such a trade. Despite his hesitancy, Shippen was not opposed to a trade with Native Americans, but instead was far more preoccupied with who ought to have the authority to regulate such a trade. In a 1759 letter to his cousin, Colonel James Byrd, Edward Shippen complained about the construction of a new military road that would give the Virginians and the, quote, worthless Marylanders a fine opening to Pittsburgh. Shippen quips that this new road would allow them the sweets of an Indian trade, before going on to remark, though for my part, I should call them the sours. Shippen's fixation on who could or should be trading at Pittsburgh speaks not only to his hesitancy regarding an Indian trade, but also to the broader conflict of authority over both Native American policies and trade along the mid-Atlantic frontier. The question of who would regulate a Native American trade was almost as contentious as an issue as the establishment of the trade itself. In a 1758 letter to his commander-in-chief, James Abercrombie, General John Forbes complained about the overlapping authority between imperial and military leaders and provincial leaders. Forbes noted that it was imperative to provide everything that can keep the Native Americans steady to our interest, as there is not the least trust to be put in the dilatory measures of the provinces. As colonial leaders clashed with imperial leaders and each other over who would regulate a trade with indigenous groups, Forbes remained concerned that those debates would end up threatening the peace that such a trade was trying to preserve. While Forbes feared the squabbling among colonial leaders would threaten peace, provincial leaders feared the same results from the intrusion of imperial leaders. On October 9, 1761, Thomas Penn wrote to his deputy governor, James Hamilton, expressing his deep frustration with Sir William Johnson. Penn wrote, "For such a man as Johnson, and even his deputy, to put themselves on par, or rather above, governors of provinces, I think, very improper." Penn argued that it should be the provincial governors who brokered peace with native groups. If there had to be an imperial official, Penn was confident that Johnson was completely unqualified. Penn complained that Johnson was far too invested in his own colonial government of New York and in his personal interests in the West, writing, "This man is a trader and a purchaser of land also, both which render him very unfit." Penn's scathing critique of Johnson highlights the deeply contested themes of authority and legitimacy that colored and complicated Native American diplomacy throughout the 1750s and 60s. As colonial and imperial elites squabbled over who had the authority to regulate a Native American trade, carrying out such a trade became confusing for local traders and trading companies who struggled to keep up with the ever-changing rules and regulations. In October 1761, Andrew Wilkins, a small trader at Venango, wrote to the Baton, Wharton, and Morgan Company begging for his debts to be extended a few months longer. Wilkins argued that he was sure to earn enough to repay his debts by the following summer because Mr. Croghan has given me his promise that no other trader shall be here but myself. This promise Croghan made to Wilkins is certainly a reasonable one. As Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Croghan was definitely in a position to make such a promise credible. However, in doing so, Croghan claimed imperial authority over the Native American trade, something colonial leaders certainly resented. Despite Croghan's assurances, Wilkins remained uncertain and felt the need to repeat his position as the only trader in Venango to his creditors multiple times. Wilkins' appeal to the Baton, Wharton, and Morgan Company demonstrates how these debates among colonial and imperial leaders trickled down to create confusing and fraught native policies. These conversations about trade that small traders like Wilkins struggled to navigate were also steeped in real and terrifying violence throughout the mid-Atlantic frontier. During the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War, violence and the fear of violence became the axis upon which daily life revolved for poor backcountry settlers. In his diary, James McCullough, a Scots-Irish weaver living in the Pennsylvania backcountry throughout the 1740s and 50s, kept a log of his daily interactions and trade accounts. However, his daily trade was interrupted by increased Indian violence. Beginning in 1748, McCullough's diary contains accounts of various transactions, observations of weather, and biblical verses. But by February 1756, McCullough's trade entries had been entirely replaced by a running list of captives and victims of Indian violence, including 2 of his own children. This abrupt shift in McCullough's diary from a record of his trade relationships to a list of captives taken by Native groups provides a poignant example of the disconnect between the Indian policies established by elite leaders like Johnson with the reality of the frontier. McCullough, too, had prioritized his trade relationships, but by the mid-1750s, the violence of the 7 Years' War had superseded any consideration of trade. As Native American warfare and violence permeated their daily lives, backcountry settlers throughout the mid-Atlantic railed against the establishment of a trade with Native Americans that had so recently been their enemies. In 1764, during the Pamphlet War, in the aftermath of the Paxton Boys massacre of the Conestoga Indians, several authors spoke directly to these fears of an Indian trade. In a poem called The Cloven Foot Discovered, the pro-Paxton author wrote satirically, "Go on, good Christians, never spare, to give your Indians clothes to wear. Send 'em good beef and pork and bread, guns, powder, flints, and store of lead, to shoot your neighbors through the head. Encourage every friendly savage to murder, burn, destroy, and ravage. Of Scotch and Irish let them kill, as many thousands as they will." This author explains the dangers of a Native American trade for frontier inhabitants in visceral clarity. By opening a trade with Native American groups, colonial and imperial leaders condemned those living along the Pennsylvania backcountry to a life of violence and fear. The Paxton Boys were not the only extra-legal group to respond to a Native American trade with violence. In May 1765, James Smith led an extra-legal group called the Black Boys that attacked a convoy of goods destined for trade with Native Americans at Fort Loudon in Cumberland County. Smith echoed the anti-trade sentiments of his predecessors, the Paxton Boys, in his memoir, writing that Native Americans were low on ammunition and to supply them now would be a kind of murder and would be illegally trading at the expense of the blood and treasure of the frontiers. To backcountry inhabitants, opening trade with Native Americans had immediate, tangible, and terrifying negative consequences. From the perspective of those living along the frontier who had felt the brunt of warfare and violence throughout the 1750s and 60s, opening a trade with Native Americans was tantamount to murder. In the face of the establishment of such an intolerable trade with Native Americans, groups such as the Paxton Boys and the Black Boys turned to violence to assert their own authority over indigenous diplomacy. This turn to violence by the Paxton Boys and the Black Boys was not the result of wild passion or uncontrollable anger, but rather was a calculated claim of authority over indigenous diplomacy and policymaking. James Smith and many others among the Paxton Boys and the Black Boys had served in militias and local units during both the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War. In fact, just 4 short months before the Paxton Boys massacred the Conestoga Indians, Edward Shippen wrote to his son Joseph, extolling the virtues of the, quote, Paxton and Shippensburg brave boys, who lately defeated the Native Americans in Muncie, Pennsylvania, who had allied with Pontiac during the Pan-Indian War against European encroachers. So as the establishment and regulation of a Native American trade threatened their lives and livelihoods, frontier folk leveraged this military service to communicate their discontent with Indian policies determined by colonial and imperial leaders. The Paxton Boys massacre of the Conestoga Indians, who were living under the protection of the Pennsylvania government, demonstrates the fears that shaped the kind of Indian policies frontier folk desired. Similarly, in targeting goods shipped by the Baton Wharton and Morgan Company to Pittsburgh and Detroit for trade with Native Americans, the Black Boys made a clear, violent statement against a Native American trade. The Paxton Boys and the Black Boys both believed their violence against Native Americans was merely an extension of their military service for the good of the British Empire, which in turn allowed them to claim their own authority over Indian policy. The intersection between these claims of authority through military service and the assertion of a frontier-specific Indian policy is perhaps most clearly articulated by the actions of the Black Boys. In his 1799 memoir, James Smith consistently described the Black Boys as a legitimate military unit. Smith and his fellow Black Boys argued that the Proclamation of 1763 intended to stop all trade with Native Americans beyond the proclamation line. As traders began to move their goods west anyway, these men railed against the traders and the British military that supported them. After describing several skirmishes between his men and the British military officials stationed at Fort Loudon, Smith relents and admits that the confrontation had gotten entirely out of the channel of the civil law, and many unjustifiable things were done by both parties. However, even in his admission of foul play, Smith holds the actions of his men entirely equal to the actions of the British military. This confidence in the legitimacy and authority of the Black Boys' actions is further reflected in a song written by George Campbell in 1765 and recorded in James Smith's memoir, commemorating the bravery and just cause of the Black Boys' actions. Campbell's verses draw heavily from militaristic imagery, as he describes the Black Boys as brave souls who bravely stood to act for their king and their country's good. In clearly aligning their cause with the king and country, both Smith and Campbell demonstrates the Black Boys' claims to authority over the Indian trade. Drawing off their military experience and authority, the Black Boys and the Paxton Boys used violence and intimidation to communicate their resistance to the establishment of a Native American trade. In doing so, these groups also asserted their own visions of indigenous diplomacy, in which all Native Americans were potential enemies and therefore should not receive the goods and supplies to levy war against those living along the Pennsylvania frontier. As a representative of both the Baton, Wharton, and Morgan Trading Company and the colony of Pennsylvania, Joseph Rigby's struggle to move goods west in 1768 demonstrates the continued conflict of authority that muddied Native American diplomacy and policymaking. However, Rigby's specific complaints about the behavior of the backcountry inhabitants confirms the lasting authority of violent groups such as the Paxton Boys and the Black Boys to regulate Native American policy and trade on the frontier. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm here today to talk about an object that has captured my imagination and interest, but which also, I suggest, captures broader historical imagination as well. For colonial and revolutionary history, for the Mid-Atlantic and material culture, and for the problematic relationship the Commonwealth has to Indigenous history across a continuum of time. The object of my inquiry was produced in an area shaped by a rich landscape of forests and streams and farms and iron-making furnaces. As a visual and material culture historian, I privilege 2- and 3-dimensional objects in my work, often held in public collections such as archives, museums, and libraries. I am drawn to objects found in the public sphere and perhaps even documented in some way, yet somehow remain unknown, underutilized, and I would even use the word unloved. In the next 20 minutes, I will introduce this unique object and offer potential readings that point to opportunities or pathways yet to be considered. I will argue that there is richness and a connection to humanity and history in bringing forward such forgotten things. One of my points is that even if objects are on display in a public space, it is still possible for an object to be overlooked, bypassed, overshadowed, or ignored, something that monuments, objects once sidelined and misunderstood, have shown us very clearly in the past decade. Man-made objects, no matter what size or shape, or who made them or where, are historical, narrative, and political. I'm in the early days of this work, but I don't think there will be much more research in the traditional sense, meaning archives or museum collections, that I can do. Instead, I wish to embrace the sculptural bust of Captain John Carleton with our mixed historical imaginations, yours and mine, which in turn will help me think about the different considerations we might bring to this narrative, especially pertinent in the lead up to the 250th anniversary, which is now less than 2 years away, and which those of us working in the public history field are striving to do, despite a lack of real funding, genuine public interest, and problematic 250 organizations. How can a forgotten or unloved museum object help? Lost my place there, sorry. Can we admit to the public that our knowledge has limitations and that when we feel confident, this confidence in what we know is really only temporary? Can this work help Americans love the practice of history versus using it as a tool for political gain? And what is a good way to approach an object with very little provenance or a story undocumented? One place to begin talking about the historical imagination I'm experiencing in Pennsylvania is, in particular, the Susquehanna River, one of the oldest rivers on planet Earth, a river that eventually empties into the Chesapeake Bay, and where generations of indigenous people made their life along the banks, fields, and forests, and not too distant Appalachian mountains, landscapes that the river and its many tributaries still rush by 350 million years after it began carving its path. The indigenous people called the Susquehannock contact period left pictographs in several places on the river, some of which are now submerged and most can only be accessed by boat. These carvings are a rich collection of visual memory keepers in the Northeast. I'm acknowledging this landscape that I moved into and its particular history, especially as it informs the objects produced out of this place, which is the subject of this talk. Captain John Carleton lived in a plexiglass box for many decades inside an old car showroom turned public history museum in York, Pennsylvania until the winter of 2024. This sculptural bust is carved from several pieces of wood of an unknown type, gessoed in areas, painted and decorated with a metal gorget, ear pendants, sometimes called ear bobs, a nose ring, hair, and a feather. Even though the object was continuously displayed for a very long time, very little is known about it. While walking through the galleries in this local history center where I was working at the time, Carleton stopped me in my tracks. A local history museum like the one in York or your city or town once functioned as the city or county's attic space. In the case of York, family heirlooms, corporate and company memorabilia, outmoded technologies of weird sizes and shapes, archives, photographs, clothing, housewares, and even old historic houses eventually came under the management of a single organization whose name was changed many times over the decades, finally settling on the County History Center, not the City History Center. Whole other conversation. There were plenty of other objects to become enamored with. Women's hats from the 1940s, perhaps, handmade quilts in different patterns, or portraits of long-gone founding fathers and mothers. But it was Carleton, perhaps a different kind of founding father, with his inscribed gorget, or is it a purposefully made label replicating the look of a gorget, with the words, Captain John Carleton, Commander-in-Chief, January 3rd, 1786, that captured my historical imagination. An incised tomahawk also appears below the lettering. The museum wall label told viewers like me that Carleton was a Conwego Indian and fought in the Revolutionary War. The accession and catalog records attached to this object do not contain any evidence for these statements. The wall label stating that Carleton was a Conwego Indian is intriguing, but how do we know the veracity? Located close to York is Conwego Creek, where a small indigenous settlement once existed. Is this close settlement location the reason for the geographic and cultural attribution to Carleton? Maybe the historical imagination of previous curators wished this to be so, and maybe they are right, but I don't know, and neither does anyone else. Museum object number 385. You know it's an early object in a museum's collection with a catalog number like this, especially in a museum system like York, which has more than 90,000 objects in its collection. This object has a slim folder of accession and curatorial information, which reads like bits and pieces of a story sidelined and then taken up and then sidelined again. From outside the museum, a researcher dedicated to the project in the 1990s tried to track down who Carleton was. The trail must have gone cold because this researcher was not heard from again, at least in the museum's records. On the other hand, a museum visitor in the fall of 22 appeared at the History Center saying that Carleton was his 6th great-grandfather. Again, no evidence, oral or otherwise, was presented, and that possibility also was not pursued. I recently read the phrase that details expose truth, and I thought about those words about the bust of Carleton. What truths can we find by looking at the details of this work of art as it was, sidelined and silent in the box? From a museum perspective, the place where many Americans get their history, although far behind media such as television, there are at least 2 ways to talk about silencing or creating absence, and both reside in the way we use history or hide it. For example, in the photograph of Carleton's placement for 2 decades and more, you see how the bust was displayed as part of the larger story of the sculptor John Fisher and his work in York. Certainly, this kind of display made sense at one point in time. York is rightly proud of this German immigrant who built a business making tall case clocks valued today for their technology and beauty. Fisher was born in 1736 or so to a prominent family in the Stuttgart region. He came to the colonies in 1749 with his parents, who both promptly died. 8 years later, he moved to York, where he established his clockmaking business, but also created other wood-related objects, such as organs and small sculptures. He made a name for himself through his work in the Mid-Atlantic. For example, his masterwork, tall case 35-day clock, is part of the Americana collection at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. In addition to his commercial carving and clockmaking work, Fisher contributed at least 2 ways to supporting the evolving creation of laws and governing bodies for his community and his new country. Fisher carved a figure of justice for the courtroom of the York County Courthouse, and for Pennsylvania, Fisher created what is considered one of the first known state seals, which you can see in the upper left corner. Yorktown was a crossroads in the sense of geography between the East and the West, in the sense of politics, as the first Articles of Confederation were drafted there in the summer of 1777, with the Continental Congress in the original courthouse building, and in the sense of cultural intersectionality, where people speaking High German, Low German, English, and Algonquian, among other languages and cultures, mixed. Many people lived in or traveled through York, and some, like Fisher, stayed for their lifetime. Still, others headed west, or in the case of Indigenous people, returned east to Philadelphia and eventually Washington, D.C. for political reasons. Add a Revolutionary War to this contested, complex landscape, and it is easy to see how a figure like John Carleton might have moved through this space, not leaving anything behind but his visage, carved into wood by a self-taught sculptor who may have been intrigued by his status. In this small display, a visitor would not learn much about Carleton, nor of the influential military and political roles Indigenous people played in the American Revolution, or of the day-to-day negotiations between the different people of Pennsylvania and beyond, before, during, or after the war. Is John Carleton silenced, and in what ways can we provide a voice to his absence? Whose responsibility is it to do this work? And what strategies of reading traces and absences might be employed to highlight and perhaps counteract the silencing? I can tell you that I have shown pictures of Carleton everywhere I go, where there are early Americanist scholars and community members of Indigenous history and culture. Almost everyone expresses interest, but no one recognizes his name, nor does the anglicized name appear in the historical record relating to York or the Revolution. Was he a real man who sat in the sculptor's workshop long enough to be sketched and then carved? Is the jewelry authentic to indigenous culture, or are they replications? Questions about the hair immediately come to mind for many reasons, and the catalog files offer contradictory information about whether the hair is human, animal, or made from fiber. What was Fisher trying to show, and for whom? The silencing process, though, is a problem not only for museums, but also for society, which museums claim to represent. I am grateful to the Pennsylvania Historical Association Committee for placing my paper directly after Sarah's. As a layperson, it is much better to have Sarah describe some of the experiences Indigenous people endured in the mid-18th century in the Mid-Atlantic. When I moved to Pennsylvania 2.5 years ago, I had questions about how it is that such a commonwealth, with its iconic pictures of Penn's Treaty, could be without official recognition for living tribes. I began to look at how Pennsylvania cares for and shares the past and present of Indigenous culture. Towards this end, I have an image from Ghost River on the screen. This beautifully drawn graphic novel retells the Conestoga story from a timeline that moves back and forth between the past and present and privileges an Indigenous viewpoint. In my research process, I spoke with Dr. Matthew Kruer at the University of Chicago, who has done work on the Susquehannock, a tribe that many scholars have overlooked. I came to understand that Native Americans in this area were already decimated in number by the late 18th century, or John Fisher's and John Carleton's time, from a possible original population of over 5,000 down to 400 people, from disease, death, and displacement. Some Indigenous people did remain, although Dr. Kruer says they would have practiced passing or blending in with European culture. And when I asked why Pennsylvania has no recognized tribes today, Dr. Kruer wrote to me, quote, "The fact that Pennsylvania has no state or federally recognized tribes, despite the long history of Indigenous-Settler relations in the colony, is a testament to the intensity of violence that severed those connections beginning in the 1750s, end quote. But as he also said during a presentation for the Library Company of Philadelphia, where he was a fellow, quote, "The Susquehannock Nation doesn't survive, but the Susquehannock people do," end quote. It is possible then that Captain John Carleton was not a Susquehannock or a Conestoga or a Conwego, but possibly a visiting Indigenous man, as many individuals and groups of men traveled the Susquehanna River Valley with its roads and waterways to head towards Philadelphia, the site of Indigenous diplomacy well into the early Republic. As Dr. Kruer pointed out in my conversation with him, quote, "The fact that he may have held an honorary rank bestowed on him by the United States, commonly signified by such gorgets, may have marked him as a foreign dignitary, perhaps from one of the Ohio nations, such as the Mingo, Shawnee, or Delaware, with ancestral ties to the Susquehanna Valley." We can help counteract the silencing by beginning to do the work that we do best, which is privileging forgotten or ignored materials, some of which are outside of official collecting repositories, and some, like the bust of John Carleton, are inside but understudied. And then, by reading and questioning the object, and perhaps applying some historical imagination to fill in those absences, just as authors did in Ghost River, we can at least have conversations about important topics, promoting visual, material, cultural, and historical literacy. There are many avenues to consider when thinking about the sculptural bust. For example, what would a conservator of wooden objects, like a staff member from colonial Williamsburg, have to say about this object? What would a conservator tell us about the origin of the hair, the jewelry, and the gorget? Was the gorget made by Fisher, who is known as a woodworker, but who also made the metal pieces for his clocks? Did he deliberately use different kinds of metals to represent American metalwork versus indigenous metalwork? Or were these objects provided to him from a source such as Carleton himself? The use of color is a conversation in art history that is always developing. The Yale Center for British Art is currently doing a project examining the creation of skin tones in paintings. What would a conservator there say about creating the coloring for the bust, and how does it compare to the many Indigenous portraits of the era? Along art history lines, my art historical imagination wants to consider John Fisher's Germanic lineage. He lived on the edge of wilderness in Pennsylvania, but he carried with him the European High Renaissance, which emphasized humanity through naturalism. I understand that Fisher's work is clunky and stylized as compared to the refined young man from Germany, which you see here, but it is a unique object belonging to the Pennsylvania wood carving tradition. I would also argue it is not a, quote, cigar store Indian, a point that I will return to soon, as it seems to exist as an object on its own, not as a model for commercial enterprises such as a store sign or advertising. So I have to wonder if Fisher didn't see the human in John Carleton, representing him as something more than a potential caricature. Carleton, through the eyes of Fisher, was a respected man and had status, as noted by the inclusion of the gorget. Although we can probably agree that Fisher was no Albrecht Dürer or any other North European master, Fisher's inclusion and emphasis on real objects inserted into the bust further extended his attempts to show Carleton as he was, using a naturalistic style worthy of our attention. There is also a multitude of ways to interact with the bust as a decolonizing opportunity, which is a way to prioritize exhibits away from white visitors towards Indigenous voices, meaning a turn away from object-based storylines or exhibits to story-centered exhibits. And further, as an object of empire, which rethinks the American experience from the lens of the global, or how this work of art ties York to settler colonialism, providing a more complicated and entangled historical narrative to the town which today remembers the Conway Cabal, Horatio Gates, and the Marquis de Lafayette, but does much less with indigeneity. Museum staff are not alone in doing this work. The recently published Indigenous Ally Museum Practitioner Toolkit by Jen Edgington uses museum evaluation tools to assess exhibits and offer guidelines to help create spaces of allyship for Indigenous communities. In closing, the narrative around the bust of John Carleton is yet to finish. The newest development in the narrative is the fact that the York County History Center, which owns the bust of Carleton, recently debuted a project a decade in the making, the total refurbishment of a Met Ed steam plant building in downtown York near the Codorus Creek. The space is only a few blocks from the old museum and the car showroom, and down a block from the recreated York County Courthouse and the General Horatio Gates House with the statue of Lafayette outside. In the image with the blue walls, you see the John Fisher wood carving area of the new museum. You'll recognize the gilded Pennsylvania state seal hanging on the wall. What you do not see is the bust of John Carleton, which did not make the cut. Even more strangely, to my eyes at least, a cigar store Indian did. When I visited recently and asked about the hundreds, if not thousands of objects that this new streamlined museum could not hold, I was told that there are plans to change out objects, therefore offering a different viewing experience to visitors. I have thoughts about that. The smaller image at the bottom is the one exhibit case in the museum with Susquehannock and Indigenous objects on display. There's a projectile point, a clay pot, wagon bells, a wagon jack from a Conestoga wagon, and a conch shell bullhorn. The large wheel that you can see in the background belongs to the largest surviving Conestoga wagon. Around the corner from these objects is a digital screen which offers a series of maps of Native American transportation routes, including footpaths and waterways. In other words, the new museum's designers fit these micro-histories into the museum's larger themes, one of which is transportation. Perhaps if the bust of John Carleton had rock-solid provenance, he would have made it into the new museum, traveling on one of the routes shown on the digital screen. Perhaps not. Is the bust of Carleton an American object, a European object, an indigenous one, or all of the above? I like the bust of John Carleton because it raises so many questions and leaves us with so few concrete answers. But they are questions worth asking. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to say a few things about each paper, but just a little bit about things that I found interesting, sort of taking advantage of my ability to ask questions first before I open it up to you all. But if it's all right, I'll just go in the order that you presented and also offer just some of my questions. I'll resist the temptation to ask all of my questions right off the bat. So starting with coal, I found this really interesting because, like many folks here, I teach some version of the early U.S. History Survey, and in it I try and emphasize Pennsylvania as much as possible. I know those of you who teach undergraduates and those of you who teach high schoolers have kind of the same thing in mind, perhaps. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the transition for Swedish landowners to English land ownership. So you were talking about them putting up fences and other kinds of improvements in order to prove themselves to the British. That's the system they're moving to. But what was their system that they were moving from? How would they establish land claims before that?
So before then, boundaries were very loose. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why I mentioned that they needed to put openings in the fences, because they rarely had any fences. They just put like little wood markers, essentially. Like they just put markers down because they realized the Swedish actually developed along more of the lines of like the common land system. Okay. They had more in the sense of like very loose boundaries, and that they sort of shared the land, almost similar to the Lenape. And so when they assimilate more into the English way, that way then they can kind of adapt to it, as I mentioned. That way then you can have the fences while also having the openings, so that then you have that traditional crossing. Again, partially why I think so is that with the Lenape in particular, if you did not have that, then you might have the threat of violence. By the way, I will say this. For those of you who are wondering about the relationship with the Swedish, in one of the letters by the 30 church congregants in 1693 to Stockholm, Sweden, so the main church of Sweden, their main comment about the indigenous people was, they haven't killed us in many years. Whoa, is that how you talk to your friends? And so it was very interesting in that regard, in that basically they're adapting to the situation that they're in to maintain maximum peace and maximum prospects. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cole. For Sarah, one thing that I found really interesting about your work is, again, I'm thinking about the early U.S. History Survey and how often we're talking about, before the Revolution, Americans being upset with the British about restrictions on Atlantic trade and on seaborne trade. And I thought this was an interesting way to take those trade disputes inland. Mm-hmm. A couple things that I'd like to know more about. I've maybe this is different for others, I don't know, but I've read some more about the Paxton Boys, but hadn't heard as much about the Black Boys' violence. If you could speak a little bit more about that. And then, am I right in guessing that this is like some of the primary source research behind a potential dissertation chapter?
Yeah.
So if you'd like to explain to us a little bit more about the whole dissertation project and where this fits in there, I'd be curious about that too.
Yeah. So for the Black Boys, just like kind of what specifically they're doing, or like what?
Just a little bit more about the context where they are and what they did and what impact it had.
Yeah. So the Black Boys, they organized in May 1765, and as I said, they're targeting goods they're heading west for Native American trade, and they're, I would say, like the Paxton Boys, the Black Boys, and there's a group in Virginia, the Augusta Boys. They're kind of part of this broader anti-Indian movement where frontier folk are like making specific violent, claims or attacks against Native American diplomacy. So I hope that gives a little bit more context about the Black Boys.
Is it okay if I interject just
sure,
a moment?
Yeah.
One of the things I was also thinking about is how exerting violence and claiming the right to justify your violence, that feels like a sovereignty claim to me, if you wanted to use that term.
Yeah, so the larger, to kind of, that feeds nicely into your second question, the larger dissertation project. Aspirationally, it's going to be transatlantic. I'm very interested in language as a method of communication to communicate grievances. And in the dissertation, I have the three groups in North America that I've mentioned. And then there's three groups in Ireland, the White Boys, the Oak Boys, and the Steel Boys, all kind of happening at the same time, talking about these same questions of authority, using the same tactics, the same costuming. So it seems to me that there is kind of this like common understanding of what certain kinds of violence communicates. And so I'm really interested in using the Paxton Boys and the Black Boys and the Augusta Boys in Virginia as kind of a case study in exploring how violence is being used to communicate grievances, and where that line of sovereignty and, are they being rebellious and challenging the government, or do they see them as part of a certain kind of authority? I'm still kind of trying to tease all of that out because there is so much kind of overlap in these claims, but that is kind of the central question of the dissertation, is how are these people using violence to claim authority, and in what ways?
Cool. Thanks, Sarah. For Laura, I'm a little bit newer to public history, but I am trying to incorporate it as much as possible into my classes, and maybe other folks are doing this too, because we want our students to be more aware of all the jobs that are out there that you can get with a history major.
I always go straight to the job, the job market.
I mean,
how to get a life, right? How to get
unfortunately, that's basically what all of our college marketing materials are about these days.
Indeed.
So,
did you work STEM into that too?
Yeah, sure. I think we should. I mean, shouldn't it be STEM or something?
STEAM, it's STEAM.
STEAM, but we got to get an A, we got to get an H in there somehow, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
STEAM, or I don't know.
Pennsylvania.
if we can add history. But I was wondering, what might you imagine if you were thinking about something like an exhibit that might have this bust at the center that admits uncertainty? I mean, you mentioned a few times how lots of Americans go to museums and feel that the tangible objects kind of give extra authority to the accounts being given in museum exhibits. But how might you do something like push people toward asking questions instead, or like being aware that we're not going to resolve the conflicts between multiple possible interpretations?
Well, it's good timing, I think, for you to ask that question, because I'm also wondering if all of you had read the AHA publication this week that came out about teaching, right? I don't know if it was based K through 12 or yeah, it was. So the American Historical Association published a report, like a white paper, about the state of teachers using history, what they want out of museums, what they need to kind of help the state of affairs, as it were. And object-based learning is still kind of one of the things that comes up again and again. So I'm not sure I would think about John Carlton as the center of an object. I was thinking of it as the center of a community conversation, so that the bust would be there, but that different people from different perspectives would be able to come together and ask questions together, and maybe think about lines of research together and write wall labels together, whatever a group wanted to do. Of course, I'm a person of one saying, this object's really important. Why isn't anybody paying attention? So it takes kind of more of a mass interest. But I also think it's incumbent upon our museums and historic sites to kind of do the first work and do the groundwork, because so many people still think of like walking through a door of a museum and you're just kind of like, oh, I can't touch anything, I can't ask any, that curator is behind the door. How could I ever talk to a curator? And I just really would love people to kind of get over that, because it really has done harm, I think, in the long run to how society thinks about using history as a tool.
Cool. Thanks, Laura. I'd like to open things up out there, but I guess maybe before we do that, can we have one more round of applause for these folks? Thank you for sitting through my questions, and now it's time for yours. So go ahead.
Thank you to all the panelists. Really, all three were fascinating papers. I'll ask one question so I don't take up all the time. For Sarah, the Black Boys, you know, it's so, if I heard you right, you're talking about how frontier peoples were really discontent with Pennsylvania policies and maybe unhappy with any trade with natives in 1765, particularly the Black Boys. Where do you stand on the issue of continued black boy regulation after June 20th, when Governor Penn says he officially reopens the trade? I know it's a bit of a little historiographic kind of cliche to most people. And then how does that kind of maybe make you reassess the idea of frontiers people unhappy with any trade at all?
Yeah, I'll say a disclaimer that I have thought mostly about like the things leading up to 1765.
So I haven't thought much beyond like the initial moment of violence. But I think the conversations that happen after June with the Black Boys, I mean, I still think they're still negotiating authority. They're still trying to figure out who has, who can regulate what and who is in charge of what. I'm not sure that that's answering your question, but that's kind of what I'm looking to think about as I move forward in the project. But I'll definitely like jot that down and continue to think about that, like beyond 65.
Go ahead. You're also more than welcome to ask John questions.
I just have a question though, because you're talking about the European indigenous affairs, right? Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, because you talked about the diplomacy of William Johnson with the Delaware, the Lenape. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you know if the Iroquois influenced him? Because he was such an ally of the Iroquois, and knowing the history, even in the 17th century, between the Iroquois and the Lenape, it's very tenuous. In fact, if you know, in the 1744 Lancaster Treaty, they called the Lenape women. Mm-hmm. So essentially, they were not allies to any extent.
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of a conflict of authority within indigenous groups themselves while all this negotiation is happening. So William Johnson does have close kinship ties to the Iroquois, and generally the assumption of British imperial and even colonial leaders is that all Native American diplomacy needs to be filtered through the authority of the Iroquois. So any treaty that you're signing with like the Delaware or the Shawnee also has to be approved by the Iroquois. In 1756, the Delaware, and I believe the Shawnee as well, go to war against Pennsylvania, hoping that will like throw off the yoke of Iroquois rule. Yeah. So there is a lot of tension in between indigenous groups as well that I didn't get to in this talk, but hopefully in the chapter. Yeah.
Thanks. Other folks, go ahead.
All right. So I'm sort of piggybacking on all of this, sort of thinking about it, about authority, negotiating authority. And it strikes me that in the 1760s, particularly 63 to like 68, authority there's a vacuum of authority.
Right.
Because 63, it says you're to regulate trade through proclamation. That results in the Board of Trade creating this new vision for how Native American diplomacy will carry forward. Yeah. It never happens. And so now we're in this position where Johnson's claiming one thing, Stewart's claiming another in the South, Gage is claiming another thing. The governors are claiming another power, and nobody quite knows. Right? And it never gets solved, and there's no one voice. So even in the Imperial Center, there's no one voice. Because like Lord Shelburne doesn't want anything to do. Right? So there's not like, even there's not like, well, this is the way authority will function. And in that vacuum, you get a lot more violence. Right? And negotiating over who actually has control. But also, right, what strikes me what you said today was that, like the Black Boys, for instance, they're not quite they're not like claiming authority for themselves. They're claiming that they are
the one voice.
Operating on behalf of another authority. Right. Whether that be the king or the colony, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and the Augusta boys do that too. The Augusta boys have that same claim of like, we are for king and country, this is justice. They call out Andrew Lewis as like a traitor to the crown and put a bounty on his head, so yeah.
I have a question. Sorry.
My name is Kurt Miner. I'm with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. I am a curator. You can speak to me, by the way. I just have a comment just in relationship to Laura's paper, which is there is in fact a mechanism with government-funded museums to review the kinds of objects that you are identifying. It's called NAGPRA. We're historians. We may not be familiar with that, but if you're an archaeologist, you certainly are. It's Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And it's been around for a long time, but it's in the last year the objects that are required to be reviewed have been expanded beyond simply human remains, which is what most people think of it, to objects of cultural patrimony, which is a very broad category, which could include the object that you've identified, which is, I agree, not just a cigar store Indian. The problem is that law, and it is a federal law, only applies to government-funded museums. So having said all that, I wanted to clarify something you mentioned. Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that I work for does work with federally recognized tribes. We've been reviewing our collections for the past several years in conjunction with representatives from federally recognized tribes, which is not uncommon with most states. They don't do state tribes for lots of interesting and political reasons. But I will say that the result of that is often that objects are removed from exhibition. So it's an interesting double-edged sword. We want to tell the story, but we also need to be respectful and follow federal law in the case of the state-associated museums in Pennsylvania. If you want to learn more about this, show up this evening. There will be a banquet session that will include a representative from the Delaware tribe who is working directly with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, our archaeology department, and our sites, including Pennsbury Manor, which has been a site, incidentally, for repatriation and reinterment of human remains that have been found in our archaeological collections, which are very deep. And we've been in this area for over 100 years, and we are working to rectify this. But it's a very interesting tension between telling stories which we think need to be told, but respecting the role of federal tribes in telling their stories in the way they want them to be told, which complicates all this, but it makes it more interesting. I have a second quick question, which, Sarah, I would like to ask of you if I could, as a double question, sorry, different person. I've heard this story before, I feel, that you're telling, most recently with Patrick Spiro, Frontier Rebels in Frontier Country, and I'm just curious where you situate your contribution to this story, which I think, fortunately, people are getting to know very well now. And so, I'm sorry, those are two different questions.
Do you want to respond first, or?
No, I think I'm really glad that you brought up considerations. Well, Pennsylvania as a Commonwealth does not have any, but it's because, I mean, we're talking about Eastern peoples who were in borders that did not exist in their minds or in their lives, right? But still, it is something to say.
Yes, we work with federally recognized tribes who have historically
right
lived in Pennsylvania, so that's.
But not across Pennsylvania, right?
No, across Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Well,
Western.
So yes.
Yeah.
That applies to the entire Commonwealth.
All right. So that is an important, I think.
But it is government-funded museums that are required to comply with NAGPRA. Organizations like York it's they can volunteer this. They're not required to comply with it unless they receive federal funding.
Yeah, only federal funding.
Right, so it really would be like a community member who would say, I'm interested in this. Yeah.
But it also extends to, as Kurt was saying, we work with, is that if your organization, for example, has received a grant from PHMC, then you're obligated to report any NAGPRA objects. And objects go, this time around, because the NAGPRA was renewed January 28th, 2024, so it extends going on, but with Kurt said, beyond human remains, it goes to all different types of objects. We're looking at images, we're looking at media, we're looking at archaeological records, all your primary resources, so it's gone beyond just object, it's going into 2D and media records as well.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
There's a conference there.
There is one in February.
Where is it?
Louisiana.
Oh.
It's the Office of Indian Affairs.
Oh.
Yeah, it's their annual repatriation conference.
Because I went to the Lenape last year at, what's the name of the college? My goodness, it's leaving me. And probably some of you have been there. But
Is that at Dickinson?
Was it not Dickinson? No. I can't think of the name. But they do not talk about technical issues, which this kind of crosses into. It's more. Yeah, well, the name of the college, do you have the name? I really, it's like, it's on my tip of my tongue, and so I can't think of it. But no, it's in Pennsylvania, and they hold it every year. It's a small liberal arts college.
Dickinson did start. There is a center that started a few years ago.
Yeah, they just held their first conference.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But it wasn't that. But, okay, thank you. And so Sarah.
Your question about like how I situate myself in the historiography, particularly related to Pat Sparrow's work. My goal for the dissertation is to make this like geographically broader. I'm going down into Virginia. I'm hoping to go like include groups from Ireland. So these same questions of authority, but like on a kind of transatlantic or at least like throughout the entire frontier scope. So that's
You're broadening his
yes.
out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Just one short comment and then a question. David, you talked about land and claims and that sort of thing, which is I find interesting in early America. I'm sure a lot of people do. But you talked about putting up fences, coal, and things like that. And I can't remember which historian said, settlers came from a continent that was littered with not only like castles, but lots of walled cities. America, no walled cities. We don't do that here.
Yeah,
Just totally different in conception. And there's a lot of talk about how Native Americans viewed the land, but I think a lot of settlers had to adapt to that openness. I think made a lot of them feel uncomfortable. Some, probably like the Black Boys, found that great, full of opportunity. So I think we still have yet to really quite understand how land was viewed here during that time. Certainly there were connections, if you have a First Nation that says this is where we hunt, this is where we fish, this is where we live, there's those connections, but it wasn't like you can't walk on my land. In fact, I think in general, to close things off was offensive, just generally offensive. That you could travel pretty freely, although there is evidence that you had to travel the right way. You had to stay on the path, and it kind of reminds me of talk one time, if you just walk through the woods, somebody's going to think you're up to no good and you're going to get in trouble. So I think that whole topic's just fascinating.
And could I comment on that? Just because I think it also makes it really interesting, though, with all the different Europeans and how when they come over from across the Atlantic, they have different conceptions of land to begin with. So I mentioned about the Swedes on how when they come over, they have different concepts of land than the English do, which is also why I think, too, people like Marcus Jacobson, yeah. I was thinking of Johnson, thank you. Marcus Jacobson, the Lone Finn, or the Lone Swede, we don't know exactly his ethnicity, but I think that was one of his fears, because with the Dutch, they seem to be more based on ports. That's why I said like small plantations, but they were mostly based on ports and getting into the fur trade in different avenues. But with the English, they were more plantation based, and that made it a lot scarier, especially with Francis Lovelace trying to establish a lot of different settlers in this period, which is why I consider this such a pivotal moment. And in my original paper, I mentioned 1669 as the beginning year, because that's really when one begins to see this contention die off almost. You have some, like a Dyke Uprising, for instance, in 1675, but when I examine that whole situation, it's more of like a workers' uprising against a boss, rather than it was to completely rid the Delaware Valley of English authority. And so it's just really interesting too to me that this is a pivotal moment in change, when the people who are in power are the people who then desire English rule and want to benefit from it. And that's really that pivotal moment of change. And when Andros takes over and tries to develop a more structured jurisdiction and economy in the Delaware Valley, that's where you really begin to see this concept applied. This idea that they're trying to assimilate, even cooperate with the English imperialist system.
Cool. Thanks, Phil. Sorry,
I'm sorry.
We're at our time. If you have more questions, please come up and continue the conversation. This doesn't have to be the end of the conversation, but we do have to, move on to the next event in this room and all that stuff. So can we have one more round of applause, one last one? Thanks everybody for coming.